This is too easy. Now to get to my ship.
It's not always easy to be a Star Wars fan, but it must really suck to be a Star Wars Battlefront fan right now. After two amazing games back in the mid-2000s, a third game in the series was unfortunately cancelled in 2008, and was eventually followed by a reboot in 2015 that launched with barely any content. And then the 2017 sequel launched with a big controversy surrounding its loot box microtransactions that soured the experience for many people. Now, the recently released Battlefront Classics collection from the same studio who did the Tomb Raider remasters that I just covered is one of the worst launches so far this year, it seems, and I was planning on buying it and covering it here for the channel, but currently it looks like you'd have more fun playing the PlayStation Portable version of Battlefront 2. Thankfully, however, the new Masters of the Remaster, Nightdive Studios, very recently brought back another classic Star Wars game with fantastic results in the form of Star Wars Dark Forces Remastered. It's another game that for years has been trapped in DOSBox purgatory, and it has now been revitalized with enhanced visuals and updated controls for modern consoles and PC. But what made this game so interesting to begin with, and what makes this remaster feel so good? Well, let's take a look at Star Wars Dark Forces, shall we?
Are you ready?
The history of Star Wars in video games is definitely an interesting topic, as Dark Forces was far from being the first game based upon the franchise. JonTron's series Starcade is an entertaining deep dive into the colourful and often amusing history of Star Wars games. But for Dark Forces, the story begins in the early 90s. In 1993, the first-person shooter genre was changed forever with the release of id Software's Doom, a revolutionary game that combined fast-paced action horror gameplay with groundbreaking visuals and technology. Much like their previous game, Wolfenstein, Doom was built using a 2D sector-based engine that, when rendered, looked like a 3D game. However, with the use of binary space partitioning, Doom was able to create maps that had floors with various different heights to create far more complex scenes than anything seen in Wolfenstein. There was a limitation to this, of course. Due to the 2D sector-based nature of the engine, things like rooms above one another were impossible, but that didn't really matter too much at the time. Doom was a smash hit, and in its wake, modders and other developers quickly got to work on their own projects inspired by the success of Doom. There were a number of games that innovated and built upon the foundations of Doom, such as Heretic in 1994, that used a modified version of the same engine, as well as Duke Nukem 3D, which was developed with the Build engine, another sector-based engine similar to Doom. The developers at LucasArts noted the success of Wolfenstein and Doom, and that modders were already creating levels based upon Star Wars for Doom. There was clearly a desire to see Star Wars as an FPS, and that was the basic genesis for Dark Forces.
Obi-Wan has taught you well.
Released in March 1995 for PC and later in 1996 for the PlayStation, Star Wars Dark Forces was both an extremely fun Star Wars game and an impressive technological advancement for the genre. Built on the studio's in-house Jedi engine, it featured a number of improvements over the Doom engine, such as the ability to jump and crouch, as well as being able to look up and down. More impressive though was the inclusion of true 3D elements like Kyle's ship seen at the start of almost every level, as well as 3D platforms and other environmental objects. The Jedi engine also allowed for sectors, or rooms, to be positioned above each other in the same space, which allowed for more complex and realistic feeling level design. There was still a limitation in that the engine couldn't render two sectors on top of each other simultaneously, and levels still made use of silent teleporters. Like you can see here in the stairwell, that the geometry doesn't quite make sense, but it's still an impressive improvement over the Doom engine nonetheless.
Most impressive.
Dark Forces was also one of the first games in the genre to really incorporate a proper narrative, with cutscenes between some of the levels and dialogue being used sporadically, making it feel a lot more involved than just simply running around shooting stormtroopers, though you still do quite a lot of that. It was quite unique for the time, and even Quake, which came out a year later, still didn't really have much of a story to it. The game saw you playing as a mercenary named Kyle Katarn, who in the opening mission is hired by the Rebel Alliance to steal the plans for the Death Star, which apparently was a lot easier than the film Rogue One made it out to be. Can I also just say that the biggest crime Battlefront 2 committed was not letting me play as Jyn Erso again?
You can't talk your way around this.
After stealing the Death Star plans, Carl then becomes involved in an investigation that leads to the discovery of something called the Dark Trooper Project. And what's pretty cool about this is that the Dark Troopers have actually become canon in the official Star Wars timeline, appearing for the first time in live action during the second season of The Mandalorian. Now, because I didn't get my first PC until I was a teenager, my first experience with Dark Forces was on the PlayStation, which has generally been regarded as the inferior version of the game, but I have something of a soft spot for it. In fact, it wasn't the only first-person shooter that I experienced first on PlayStation. I remember playing the PS1 port of Hexen at a friend's house, which is a notoriously difficult game as it is without the PS1's slow frame rate, long loading times, and somewhat awkward controls. It's also a game that I didn't properly get around to playing again until we were all in COVID lockdown. The other big one was Doom, specifically the PS1 port of Final Doom, and that experience alone I think could warrant a video of its own. For years following the release of Star Wars Dark Forces, there were only two official ways to play the game: the PlayStation version, which I have on my PS3, or the DOSBox version, neither of which are overly appealing options in 2024. There is an unofficial source port available called the Force Engine, which is actually quite a good way to play Dark Forces, but you do need to own a copy of the original game before you can use it. So this is where Nightdive Studios comes in. Following on from their other stellar remaster works on games like Quake 2 and System Shock, Star Wars Dark Forces Remastered is another fine achievement for the studio. Rebuilt using the game's original code on the Kex engine, Dark Forces Remastered looks immediately recognizable and at the same time noticeably different too. It's very similar to the Quake remasters in that when you first start playing it, assuming that you have played it before, the visuals look pretty close to how you might remember them looking. But upon further inspection as you keep playing, you'll start to notice all the improvements Nightdive have made. All of the game's texture work and sprites have been completely redrawn with much higher resolution artwork, while still retaining that particular Doom era look to the visuals. And just like every good remaster should have, there's an option to flick back and forth between the original graphics and the remasters. Though for me, it really was playing through the PS1 version again that truly put into perspective just how much work Nightdive put into the visuals for this remaster.
Most impressive.
The art direction still holds up incredibly well almost 30 years later too. From all the texture work and the world geometry and the levels, to the fantastic sprite work on all the Imperial soldiers and alien enemies you fight, it all just really evokes the same visual language of Star Wars. I mean, there's even one level where you fight your way through a Rebel Star Cruiser that looks very similar to the one seen at the start of A New Hope.
Leave that to me.
Also, in typical Nightdive fashion, all of the game's cinematics have been completely remade, instead of using an AI upscaler like in the Tomb Raider remasters, which I mentioned in my video didn't look all that great. It really is almost impossible to fault Nightdive Studios' attention to detail, and my only real complaint with the presentation is that the music doesn't sound all that great when using the general MIDI mode. It tends to crack and stutter a bit, though the OPL 3 mode thankfully sounds great.
Doesn't sound so bad to me.
Which I guess then just leaves the question of how well does Dark Forces actually play now in 2024? And I think I can confidently say that for the most part, it still holds up remarkably well. Obviously, on console, there are a lot of improvements to the controls, especially compared to the PS1 version as you might expect, with moving and aiming now being on the analog sticks, and the game now uses a weapon wheel instead of manually cycling through guns with multiple button presses. Since the game came out in the midst of the Doom clone era, naturally it does share a lot in common with Doom in terms of its basic gameplay formula. You venture through levels, shooting enemies and finding keycards in order to progress further into new areas. Much like how the shotgun in Doom was your main workhorse weapon, the Imperial Blaster Rifle is going to be your main go-to weapon throughout most of the game. Even though it's not always especially accurate, which I imagine is a direct reference to how terrible stormtroopers are at aiming in the films, it does do pretty decent damage and has a fast fire rate. There are other weapons too, like the Imperial Repeater is essentially the chain gun, the Fusion Cutter is kind of like the plasma rifle, and you have bigger guns like the Mortar and Assault Cannon for when you have to fight enemies like the Dark Troopers.
I like this thing.
I played through the campaign on normal, and the difficulty of the combat kind of flips back and forth between being fairly easy and then being rather hard. For me, it was never really the increasingly larger enemy counts that was challenging. It was more so the fact that Dark Forces really loves to use traps, such as mines scattered across the levels, and also turret guns, both of which are capable of dealing massive damage to the player. I may not have outright been directly killed by the mines or turrets, but they certainly led to me dying shortly afterwards. Usually to the one really fucking annoying enemy in the game, being these aliens called Grands. They're not particularly hard to kill, but what makes them infuriating is their ability to throw thermal detonators, or grenades at you, and I swear that they never seem to fucking miss. If you see a grenade leave their hand, it's already too late, unless you get very lucky and trick them into a throw that hits a wall or a ceiling above them, and these guys are in abundance during the second half of the campaign. Most of the other enemies, however, aren't too bad to deal with, and in fact, the final boss I managed to defeat without even taking a single hit.
All too easy.
The big way in which Dark Forces really differs from Doom is with the level design and the game's pacing. As mentioned earlier, the Jedi engine's ability to have sectors above each other made for much more complex level layouts compared to Doom, and because of the more story-driven nature of Dark Forces, you often have more than one objective in a level to complete. Some of these objectives do still ultimately boil down to hunting for keycards, but there are a lot more puzzle-based objectives that break up the action. Like, for instance, a keycard you find might not actually unlock a door on its own. Sometimes that keycard has a code on it that you have to enter into a control terminal, which you may or may not have passed already somewhere in the level. Other puzzles revolve around moving platforms to reach new areas. Like this tower here requires you to move this platform to different heights in order to reach a series of switches. One puzzle near the end of the game really stood out, where you had to press a combination of switches in order to line up these different parts of a nearby wall, like a power grid of some sort, which is pretty cool for a shooter from 1995. Combine these puzzle-solving elements with the more complex level layouts of Dark Forces, and you'll find that there is a bit more backtracking involved with this game in some levels compared to Doom. Another difference too is that typically upon completing the final objective in a level, you'll then have to exfiltrate the area in your ship from an extraction point somewhere, usually back at the start of the level. And what's cool is that the game will actually spawn in new enemies on your way back, making for some fun and frantic escapes back to your ship, especially with the game's dynamic soundtrack. This much more complex level design and pacing did seem to come at a cost to the game's overall length, however, as it is a shorter game than Doom, with only 13 levels compared to 27 in the original Doom.
Be careful not to choke on your aspirations, Director.
As far as complaints go for Dark Forces Remastered, my only real gripe is that the game still doesn't allow you to quick save or create manual saves, instead still relying on the old live system, where essentially you could respawn upon dying without losing any level progress based on how many lives you have, which is usually about 3 unless you know where extra ones are hidden. While it's not a massive issue since the game is fairly short anyway, it still feels rather archaic in 2024, and the ability to quick save was actually a feature implemented into the Force Engine source port. I think a nice middle ground could have been the option to play through the game in a classic mode with lives, and then in a modern mode with quick saves enabled. Kinda like Crash Bandicoot 4 had a classic mode with the live system.
Doesn't sound so bad to me.
But at the end of the day, outside of this really minor gripe, it's pretty hard to fault this remaster, and I had an absolute blast playing through Star Wars Dark Forces again. All of the visual enhancements make it a real joy to play through again if you're a fan of the original, or if you've never played it before. Nightdive Studios have now provided the best way to experience the game for the first time. But that's going to be all for this video. Do let me know in the comments what you think of Dark Forces and what are some of your favourite Star Wars games. I know I had a blast with Jedi Power Battles on PS1 back in the day. Until next time, stay safe out there everyone, don't forget to pick up some power converters from the Toshe station, and I'll see you all in the next video, which might be Dragon's Dogma 2, or Resistance Retribution, or it might be Jak and Daxter, I'm not sure yet.
I find that answer vague and unconvincing.